In this lesson, I'll talk about validation, especially in relation to model binding like we learned about 2 lessons ago. So the goal of the MVC framework's validation features is to ensure that users input correct data into the form fields of a view. And whenever I use the term correct data, I'm really talking about any constraint that we put on a particular field, like, is this a required field? Is the data in the correct length and it's not longer or shorter than we were expecting? Does the data follow the correct pattern? So if you think about credit card numbers, phone numbers, email addresses, dates, these all have very specific ways that they're represented. And does the data that the user typed in match the type of data that we're expecting based on its format? And then finally, is the data within the correct range? So we might be expecting the user to input a number from 1 to 10 and they input like 1,000, right? And so we would want to say, can't do that. It doesn't make sense in our application. So these are the sorts of constraints that I'm talking about. Now, if you'll recall at the very outset as we began this series, I said that the purpose of the controller and the purpose of the view is to reveal the model to the end user. So first and foremost, validation is the process of ensuring that the data that's input by the end user is suitable for binding to the model. And when model binding can't happen, explaining to the user what the issue is so that the user can correct it and resubmit the form. So ASP.NET MVC has a very rich validation story, and there are several different forms that validation can take, and we'll talk about most of them in this video, but there's a couple more that will kind of bubble into the next video or two. Okay, so first of all, if the end user submits data that model binding can't bind to, then it's going to put the model in an invalid state. So what I want to do to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to need to disable some of the other validation methods in order to get to the model binding situation. So to do this, what I'm going to do is go, first of all, into the web.config file, and I'm going to turn off client validation enabled. So make sure that client validation is enabled, and go ahead and make sure unobtrusive JavaScript is enabled. That'll set us up for one of the future lessons. And then go to your models folder in the product metadata, and I want you to comment out this first attribute called required and this other attribute called required that rests on top of each of the properties in our product class. All right, save all that. And now what we want to do is run the application. Let me get this sized up here so you can see what we're working with. And I want to go to the create new page. So we're going to /product/create. And I'm just going to go ahead and click the create button, and notice that it gives us an error that the price field is required. Now, where did we set that? We didn't set that. In fact, we disabled the required field. Remember, we just did that in the model. And we get the error message, the price field is required. Okay, where did we set that? We didn't set it at all. You'll recall that we actually tried to disable that on our model, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So why is this happening? Well, it's happening because the model binder that we learned about previously will attempt to create a new instance of the product class, and then it's going to attempt to set the attributes of the product using the name form field and the price form field, right? But since we didn't give it a price, it's null, and since a decimal data type can't contain a null value, it puts the model into an invalid state, and we get this default error message that's on the page right now. So let's do this. Let's go into our product controller.cs and scroll down. In my version, it's about line number 53. We want to be in the create action result method. Make sure you're in the HTTP post version of it, not the get, and set a breakpoint on if model state is valid. So let's go ahead and run the application and do the exact same thing again. Click create new, and just go ahead and click the create button, and now we're here in the model state object, and we're asking if model state is valid, true or false, and it's false. And we can kind of navigate into model state, and we can see that there are two properties, and if we look at the two keys, they're going to match the two properties or the two fields of our product class. And we can take a look at the values as well. And specifically for that second item, the price, notice that the error count is 1. Let's take a look at the error count for the first one. It's 0. So we can drill in and look at the errors and so on, okay? And basically this model state object here is managed by the model binding feature of the MVC framework. So model binding tried to bind the form fields to a new instance of product, but again, no luck, and therefore the model state's not valid. And if we don't perform this check right here before executing the code inside of the if statement, then we would probably get a nastier error right here whenever we attempted to save changes. We attempt to create in our database a new row for the product table, but we don't have one of the values that are probably required, the price field. Okay, so to recap, we use the model state object in the controller to protect the model from being in an incorrect state. So that's the first way that validation happens. Secondly, in addition to the model binding process, checking the state of the model to determine whether it's valid, we as developers can explicitly and programmatically validate incoming data. And we can do that through a series of if statements. So I'm just going to copy and paste some code. I'm going to get rid of the breakpoint here. I'm going to copy and paste some code that I wrote earlier to save a little time. But pause the video if you want to type all this in. I'll give you a clean look at it here in a second. And we just have this message off to the side there, okay? Hopefully you can see most of it there, okay? So here in these cases, in these two cases that I have, we, the programmers, are adding explicit validation statements, and if it fails the validation, then we add a model error in each case to the model state, all right? Now this first one should be self-explanatory. Here we're just checking to make sure that something has been typed into the name field. Now the second one might require a little bit more explanation because there's a couple of different checks that we're doing in the if statement. First of all, we want to see, is the field valid for price? Now up to this point, the model binder's already done its work. We already have an error in the price field, remember, as we kind of navigated through the object just a moment ago. So we can ask, is the price field valid? If not, then we want to skip this code. All right, it's already going to be taken care of by the model state when we do the check on is valid. But if it is valid, but the price is less than 1 penny, or the price is greater than $1,000, then we want to add a model error on the field price. And we just want to give the message, please enter a valid price between 1 cent and $1,000. So let's run the application and see how this is manifested. So we're going to fill in something. I'm going to make a new entry called pickles, and I'm going to give the price $1,002. Maybe I fat fingered the numbers while I was typing it in. I'm going to click create, and you can see we get our error message in line there beneath our price form field. Okay. So we know that price is a number, but is it a reasonable number for our application? We don't expect to have prices that are less than a penny or more than $1,000. So that's number 2. The third kind of variant on this is that the final form that model validation can take is through the use of data annotations. And we've looked at data annotations a number of times already in this series, right, to do different sorts of things. Well, now we're going to look at them in terms of validation. So let's open up that product metadata class in our models folder. And you can see that, and let's go ahead and uncomment out the required field here. You can see that we have several different kinds of data annotations that are used for validation. Here it's a required field. Here we want to make the string length no greater than 10, so the max length is 10. Here we have a required field as well, and we want to make sure that it conforms to this regular expression, which will ensure that it's a valid dollar amount and not like the name Bob or something like that. Okay. Now, if you take a look at this slide right here, that will take you to, and let me get there real quick. That'll take you to this page in MSDN, and if you scroll through it, you can see that there are a bunch of different data annotations that you can add. You can compare two fields against each other, so you might have a type your password again, and then compare and make sure those two fields are equal. You can do a credit card attribute to make sure that the data field value is a credit card number. You can, let's see, email address attribute. I think there was a phone attribute. There's also a range attribute, so between 0 and 1,000. So we could get rid of that code that we just wrote here, right here, by just adding a range to make sure that it's between 1 and 1,000, or 1 penny and 1,000. So let's go range. And then you can see the minimum will be 0.01 and the maximum will be 1,000.0, like that. And now we've basically done everything there that we did in those lines of code right there. Okay. Now I'm going to remove that because I have something else I want to show you and it's going to interfere with that. So let me get rid of that. Okay. So at any rate, we can apply these data annotations, and the model binder will get involved in this scenario, comparing the annotations against the data that was input by the end user. So in those three kind of situations, those three cases, we focused on protecting the model from being in an invalid state. We've relied on native model binding functionality that will attempt to convert submitted input into the model properties data type. Then we looked at setting the model state explicitly by adding model errors ourselves in C#. And then we also just looked at using data annotations to add constraints onto the model properties. But what about displaying the validation errors to the end user? How did we do that? Well, there are actually several different options. The first option is that we could roll our own solution. So we've done this before, right? In the C# fundamentals via ASP.NET web forms or web applications, I used a label server control, styled it up with a little red background, and then I printed validation messages to the users in that label. Now, that's not the right way to go about it. It wasn't really the right way to go about it, but I didn't want to talk about validation because there were bigger fish to fry. We were just learning C#. But it's also not the right way for ASP.NET MVC, and you should not do this unless you absolutely have to. You just can't get the functionality you need any other way, which I can't imagine when that scenario would happen, but it's always an option, right? The other option is to either add an inline error message like we saw several times here as we ran our application, or we could display all of the validation errors in a summary, so in bullet points at the very top or at the very bottom of the form. So we can do that if you take a look at the create.cshtml. So this is the create view, so views, products, create, and you take a look at where we're actually creating an editor for the name property and an editor for the price property. So these create the form fields. Notice below it that we have a method called validation message for, and so in this case we are going to print out any model errors that apply to the name property of our product and any validation errors that apply to the price attribute of the product. Okay, so those are for inline validation messages for one specific model property. However, you can also create the validation summary, which would then add them in bullet points. And so these two helper methods are looking at the model state, specifically for a given property in the case of the validation message 4, or the entire model in the case of the validation summary. And if it's invalid, then these methods will light up and will display the appropriate message to the end user. So I want to take a quick aside here, and I wanted to point out the fact that there was a default validation message for each of the different types of errors that you can encounter. Remember when when we hit that model binding error for price, and it just gave us that price is a required field, but we didn't add that? Well, how can you change that? We're going to talk about ASP.NET MVC 5 globalization much later. In fact, I think it's the very last lesson in this course, which allows you to create a localized message for a particular country and language. And there are also ways that we can change just the validation message for a given control. We'll talk about that in just a moment here. Actually, let's talk about it now. You can change the error message inside of data annotation, so that is the same across the entire project wherever validation has to happen on a given property for our model. So if you take a look at the product metadata, we could do this in the required field. We can add a open and close parenthesis after required, and then I think we have to do something like error message equals, and then in a string, and we can say this is a custom message, like so. Okay. And let me comment some of this out for the time being. We'll have to uncomment it again a little bit later, so we'll just keep it around. So I'm going to run the application now, and we're going to go through the same exercise we went through before. And this time, when I click Create, you can see that this is a custom message. So that's how we can change the error message for specific types of errors for a given property of our model. And then finally, you can change the error message for a given HTML form field by overriding it here in the editor, or I'm sorry, the validation message 4. So in this case, let's see which one will win if we have two different validation messages. I'm going to go ahead and put this is from the validation message 4. All right, and that should be sufficient. So let's run it again. Which one do you think will win, the model or the input to our HTML helper method? All right, it was the HTML helper method. So it overrides everything. Now the downside of this approach, the limitation of this approach, is that no matter what the error is, that's the string that will be displayed to the user, and it won't be very descriptive, obviously. However, I guess you could probably compose a acceptable catch-all message, but you probably shouldn't use this. In most cases, you should use data annotations for changing the message of error messages. All right. And then finally, there's the validation summary that we'll talk about. You can see that this very first argument here, if I were to kind of get at here and get some IntelliSense helping me out, I think this is the version we have right here. All right, this is the version right here. So you can see that there's a Boolean as the first parameter to this method, and it was set to true by the scaffolding. And so when it's set to true, property errors that are raised as a result of model binding or data annotations will be excluded from this list. So we'll demonstrate that here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and set that back to true. Well, we've already set it to true. We've already seen it in its true state. Let's do the opposite and set it to false. And so now we'll see the errors in addition to being here in line underneath the form field. We should see it show up in the validation summary. And we do. Okay, this is a custom message. The price field is required. All right, so those were the two messages that we've seen. This next input parameter is a message, and this gets displayed with the summary. We found the following issues. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. All right, you can see it just added it above the bullet points. Okay. So whenever you set this to true, any validation errors that are as a result of model binding or data annotations will not be shown, only those that we add on a custom basis. But if it's set to false, all model errors will be displayed in the list. Okay. So as we wrap this topic up, I think you should be careful about where to implement certain types of validation. If the validation is of simple data types, like required fields, the data type, and things like that, then you should use data annotations in the model along with the validation helper methods in the view. Now, if you have something that requires a little more complex logic, like you have to go to a database and see if something exists, or perform some heavy domain knowledge calculations, then that kind of changes things. You should be, in that case, layering your application right into separate concerns and not munging all the concerns together into the controller's action result methods. But if you're doing that, then any validation that's of a business rules nature should be handled in the domain layer, not here in our controller. Okay, so what about ranges? Well, that's a pretty simple check. You could probably do that in the model. Honestly, the model may even be coming from another layer of software anyway, so you just have, that's a judgment call. But if it's a more complex check or validation, then you probably want to do it in the domain layer and then bubble it up. You want to be wrapping all calls to the domain layer with try catches, and then if you get an exception, you'll want to do what we did here and add the model error and then display it to the user. Hey, we looked in the database, we couldn't find what you were looking for, please try again, something of that nature. Okay, hopefully that made sense. All right, so that's validation, at least. Validation as far as model binding is concerned. We saw how it is impacted by not only model binding but data annotations, and then how we could take control of the process and add model errors ourselves, and how to display those using HTML helper methods for inline and summary style validation messages to the end user. Okay, so that's great. We'll pick it up and talk about some of these things that we actually commented out in the web.config, I believe, in the very next lesson. So we'll talk about some of this stuff here, and we'll see you there. Thanks.